Denmark's Jehovah's Witnesses investigation, the case that closed but never ended. There are moments in public discourse when what officials say matters far more than what they officially do. Denmark just delivered one of those moments. On the surface, the news seems straightforward enough. The Danish Ministry of Ecclesiastical Affairs has officially closed its investigation into Jehovah's Witnesses. The organization's materials, they concluded, do not violate Danish law. Case closed. File away. Move on. But then came the statement that changed everything. Minister of Ecclesiastical Affairs Morten Dahlin stepped forward and declared, with unusual directness for a government official discussing a religious organization, "I have no sympathy for Jehovah's Witnesses." Not, "We respect all faiths." Not, "Religious freedom is paramount." Instead, a blunt, unvarnished statement of personal and perhaps institutional discomfort with a group his own ministry just cleared of legal wrongdoing. The contrast is jarring, almost paradoxical. An investigation ends, but condemnation begins. A legal process concludes with no violations found, yet the minister overseeing that very process publicly distances himself from the organization in question. What happened here? How do we reconcile an official closure with what amounts to an official rebuke? And perhaps most importantly, what does this tell us about the profound difficulty modern democratic societies face when trying to regulate religious organizations that may cause psychological harm without crossing clearly defined legal lines? To understand this apparent contradiction, we need to go back to where this all began. It wasn't a sudden government initiative or a legislative mandate. It started, as many important investigations do, with journalism. The Danish newspaper Ekstra Bladet began publishing reports documenting what they described as abusive practices within Jehovah's Witnesses communities in Denmark. These weren't vague allegations or second-hand rumors. The reporting detailed specific patterns of behavior, testimonies from former members, accounts of families torn apart, stories of psychological manipulation and emotional control. The articles painted a disturbing picture of an organization that, while presenting itself as a benign religious community, allegedly operated with mechanisms of control that left deep psychological scars on many who left or were expelled. The public response was significant. Former members began speaking out more openly. Families shared their pain. Mental health professionals raised concerns about the long-term psychological impact of certain organizational practices. The pressure built until the Danish government could no longer ignore it. The Ministry of Ecclesiastical Affairs announced it would conduct an investigation into Jehovah's Witnesses to determine whether their practices and materials violated Danish law. Finally, it seemed, there would be accountability. Finally, the concerns that had been whispered in support groups and therapy sessions would be examined under the bright light of official scrutiny. But here's where the story takes its crucial turn, the pivot point that explains everything that followed. When the Danish government opened this investigation, they didn't cast a wide net. They didn't examine the full spectrum of concerns that ex-members, psychologists, and researchers had been raising for years. Instead, the investigation focused on exactly two specific areas: intimate partner violence and child abuse. That's it. Nothing more. Nothing less. Two categories of potential harm, both focused on physical acts of violence or abuse that could be clearly documented, prosecuted, and punished under existing Danish criminal law. Now, these are obviously important areas to investigate. Physical violence and child abuse are serious crimes that demand thorough examination. But anyone familiar with the criticisms leveled against high-control religious groups knows that physical violence represents only a fraction of the alleged harm. What about psychological violence? What about the systematic isolation of members from outside friends and family? What about the practice of shunning, where former members are completely cut off from everyone they've ever known within the organization, including their own parents, siblings, and children? What about the emotional manipulation that keeps people compliant through fear of losing everything they hold dear? What about the coercive spiritual control that convinces members they'll face eternal destruction if they question leadership? What about the social pressures that push people to refuse potentially life-saving medical treatments? None of these were examined. None of these fell within the investigation's scope. The Danish government essentially looked at Jehovah's Witnesses through a very narrow lens, examining only whether materials explicitly promoted intimate partner violence or child abuse in ways that violated specific statutory prohibitions. And so the investigation proceeded within these tight parameters. Researchers examined official Jehovah's Witnesses publications, training materials, and organizational guidelines. They looked for explicit instructions or endorsements of physical violence. They searched for content that would clearly violate Danish laws against domestic violence or child abuse. And they found nothing that met that specific legal threshold. The materials didn't contain explicit instructions to beat one's spouse. They didn't include detailed guides on how to physically harm children. They didn't overtly advocate for criminal behavior in these narrowly defined categories. Based on this limited examination, the ministry reached its conclusion: the organization's materials do not violate Danish law. Investigation closed. But that's when Minister Morten Dahlin made his remarkable statement. Instead of simply announcing the findings and moving on, he added his personal assessment, his public disavowal of sympathy for the organization. Why would a minister do this? Why break with the typical governmental neutrality expected in matters of religious freedom? The answer lies in what the investigation couldn't examine, in the vast territory of psychological and emotional harm that exists outside the boundaries of current Danish law. Psychologists, trauma researchers, and experts who work with former members of high-control groups have been saying for decades that the most profound and lasting damage inflicted by such organizations isn't primarily physical. It's psychological. It's the systematic erosion of personal autonomy. It's the internalized fear and guilt that persists long after someone leaves. It's the complete rupture of family relationships through enforced shunning policies. It's the depression, anxiety, and complex PTSD that therapists observe in their clients who've escaped these environments. Former members describe a world where every thought is monitored, every action scrutinized against organizational standards, every doubt crushed under the weight of fear about divine punishment and social ostracism. They talk about the cognitive dissonance required to maintain belief in the face of contradictory evidence, the exhausting mental gymnastics needed to reconcile organizational teachings with observed reality. They describe the moment when they realize they can't ask questions without being labeled spiritually weak or worse, apostate. They recount the devastating choice between staying in a system they no longer believe in or leaving and losing contact with every person they love. These aren't minor inconveniences. These are profound forms of psychological suffering. But here's the legal problem. Danish law, like the law in most countries, doesn't have clear statutory definitions of psychological violence in religious contexts. Physical abuse can be photographed, documented, proven in court. Sexual abuse leaves evidence. But how do you legally define spiritual coercion? How do you create a statute that distinguishes between legitimate religious teaching and harmful psychological manipulation? How do you prosecute shunning when it's presented as a religious practice rather than emotional abuse? These are extraordinarily difficult questions, and Denmark's legal system, like most legal systems, hasn't fully grappled with them. This is precisely why Minister Dahlin's statement matters so much. He knows what the investigation found, and more importantly, what it couldn't find because it wasn't designed to look there. He understands that the official conclusion, while technically accurate within its limited scope, tells only a fraction of the story. His public statement of no sympathy isn't contradiction, it's clarification. It's his way of saying, yes, we closed this case, but don't mistake that for approval or absolution. I know what we didn't examine. I know what the law can't currently address. And I want everyone to understand that legal clearance doesn't equal moral endorsement. But there's another crucial factor influencing Denmark's cautious approach, another reason why the government might have deliberately narrowed the investigation scope rather than attempting a broad examination of psychological control mechanisms. That reason is Norway. Just north of Denmark, Norway has already fought this battle and lost in spectacular fashion. The Norwegian government, responding to similar concerns about Jehovah's Witnesses, took a more aggressive approach. They attempted to withdraw state funding and official recognition from the organization, citing practices including psychological violence, shunning, and various forms of coercive control. It was exactly the kind of comprehensive examination many advocates had been calling for. The Norwegian government essentially said, "We see the psychological harm, we recognize the control mechanisms, and we're going to take action based on that recognition." Jehovah's Witnesses sued, and they won. The courts ruled that Norwegian law didn't provide sufficiently clear definitions of psychological violence in religious contexts. Without precise legal definitions, the government couldn't prove violations. Without proven violations, They couldn't withdraw recognition or funding. The ruling was a devastating setback for those who had hoped legal systems could address the subtler forms of harm associated with high-control religious groups. But it was also a clarifying moment. It demonstrated that good intentions and genuine concerns about psychological welfare aren't enough when you're operating within a legal framework that requires specific, definable, provable violations. Denmark watched this unfold. Danish officials saw their Norwegian counterparts' aggressive approach fail in court. They observed how attempting to regulate psychological violence without clear legal definitions led to a legal defeat that actually strengthened Jehovah's Witnesses' position. The lesson was clear. If you're going to investigate and potentially take action against a religious organization, you need airtight legal foundations. You need statutory language that will hold up in court. You need definitions that can withstand legal challenge. And right now, Denmark doesn't have those tools. The Norwegian case essentially taught Denmark what not to do. Don't launch a broad investigation into psychological violence if your laws don't clearly define psychological violence in religious contexts. Don't attempt to withdraw recognition based on shunning practices if your legal system hasn't established that shunning constitutes actionable harm. Don't create a situation where you'll lose in court and inadvertently validate the very practices you're trying to condemn. So Denmark took a different path. They narrowed their focus to areas where the law is clear and unambiguous. Physical violence? That's clearly illegal. Child abuse? Unequivocally prohibited. Materials explicitly promoting such acts? Straightforward violation. But by doing so, they essentially guaranteed the investigation would find no violations, because Jehovah's Witnesses, whatever else might be said about their practices, are sophisticated enough not to publish materials explicitly advocating criminal acts. The organization's leadership understands where legal lines are drawn, at least regarding physical violence. Yet Minister Dahlin wasn't content to let this narrow exoneration stand without context. That's why he made his follow-up statements. He didn't just say he had no sympathy for the organization. He went further. He explicitly encouraged both current and former members to report any form of violence they've experienced, specifically including psychological violence. Think about that for a moment. The minister is asking people to report something his own investigation just declined to examine, something Danish law doesn't currently have clear frameworks to address. Why would he do this? Because he's building a foundation. He's collecting data. He's creating a record that can potentially support future legislative action. He's essentially saying, I can't do anything about this right now because the law doesn't give me the tools, but I want to know what's happening so we can potentially change the law. And he went even further still. The minister suggested that the official recognition status of Jehovah's Witnesses could be reconsidered in the future. He stated publicly that he's open to changing Danish legislation to better address harmful religious practices. These aren't throwaway lines. These are careful, deliberate statements from a government official laying groundwork for potential future action while being realistic about current limitations. This represents a fundamentally different approach than Norway's. Instead of charging ahead with enforcement actions that will likely fail in court, Denmark is acknowledging limitations while simultaneously working to address them. It's a longer game, a more strategic approach. Close the investigation that was bound to fail. Make clear that closure doesn't mean approval. Encourage reporting to build evidence. Signal willingness to reform laws. Create political space for legislative change. This is governance by incremental pressure rather than dramatic confrontation. But the Danish situation doesn't exist in isolation. What's happening in Denmark and Norway is part of a much larger global reckoning with how democratic societies should handle religious organizations that may cause psychological harm while staying within the letter of existing laws. Belgium has opened criminal investigations and engaged in serious parliamentary debates about whether certain religious groups should be classified as extremist organizations. The discussions there have been contentious, raising fundamental questions about religious freedom versus state protection of citizens' psychological welfare. Germany has grappled extensively with what they call high-control groups, trying to find balance between their strong constitutional protections for religious freedom and their equally strong commitment to protecting citizens from psychological manipulation. The German approach has emphasized education and support for people leaving such groups rather than direct legal action against the organizations themselves, but the debates continue. Australia conducted one of the most comprehensive examinations of Jehovah's Witnesses through their Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse. The findings were damning. The Commission documented over 1,000 cases of child sexual abuse within Australian Jehovah's Witnesses congregations that were never reported to authorities, kept internal under the organization's policy of handling such matters through religious procedures rather than involving police. The revelations shocked Australia and influenced policy discussions worldwide. Yet even with this extensive documentation, creating legal frameworks to address organizational policies that enabled such failures while respecting religious autonomy has proven extraordinarily complex. The United Kingdom has engaged in extensive debates about safeguarding requirements for religious organizations, particularly around emotional protection and psychological welfare. British discussions have focused heavily on whether current regulations adequately protect vulnerable people, especially children, from psychological manipulation and control within religious contexts. But translating these concerns into enforceable regulations without infringing on legitimate religious practice has proven as difficult there as elsewhere. Japan offers perhaps the most dramatic recent example of legislative response. Following multiple incidents involving religious groups accused of coercive control, including groups that allegedly manipulated members into severing family relationships and transferring substantial assets to organizations, Japan passed new legislation specifically targeting coercive control in religious contexts. The Japanese law represents one of the most comprehensive attempts to legally define and prohibit psychological coercion by religious organizations. But even there, implementation has been controversial and challenging, with debates about whether the law strikes the right balance or goes too far in empowering government oversight of religious practice. France has maintained its own controversial approach through legislation targeting what they call sectarian movements, providing legal tools for prosecution based on mental manipulation. The French model has been both praised as protective and criticized as potentially infringing on religious freedom, depending on one's perspective. These international examples reveal a consistent pattern. Country after country recognizes that certain religious organizations employ practices that cause genuine psychological harm to members. Country after country has citizens, former members, families, and mental health professionals raising alarms about these practices. But country after country struggles to create legal frameworks that can effectively address psychological harm in religious contexts without either failing in court or crossing lines that threaten legitimate religious freedom. The difficulties are genuine and profound. How do you distinguish between rigorous religious discipline and abusive psychological control? How do you separate heartfelt religious teachings about consequences of sin from manipulative fear-mongering? How do you differentiate between a community maintaining its boundaries and an organization deliberately isolating members from outside support systems? How do you protect people's autonomy while respecting their right to choose demanding religious communities? How do you prevent government overreach while still protecting vulnerable citizens? These aren't simple questions with obvious answers. They require balancing competing values that are all genuinely important: religious freedom, individual autonomy, psychological welfare, family integrity, children's rights, and democratic limits on state power. What makes the Danish situation particularly interesting is Minister Dahl's apparent willingness to engage with this complexity openly rather than pretending easy answers exist. His position seems to be, the current investigation closed because we examined what we could legally examine and found no violations in those narrow categories. But that doesn't mean there's no problem. That doesn't mean we're satisfied. That doesn't mean the conversation is over. Instead, let's acknowledge limitations, collect better information, consider legislative reform, and approach this as an ongoing process rather than a one-time investigation that definitively settles everything. This represents a more mature and realistic approach than either pretending problems don't exist or attempting enforcement actions that will fail and potentially backfire. But it also leaves everyone in a state of uncertainty. Current members who may be suffering have no immediate recourse. Former members seeking validation of their experiences get acknowledgement but not action. Families torn apart by shunning practices face no legal remedy. The psychological harm continues unaddressed while governments work through the slow process of potentially reforming legal frameworks that might, someday, provide tools to address these issues more effectively. And that's deeply frustrating for anyone who's experienced or witnessed the harm these practices can cause. When you've lost your children to shunning, when you've watched your parents choose organizational loyalty over parental love, when you've personally experienced the psychological devastation of realizing the group you devoted your life to systematically manipulates and controls its members, Hearing that a government investigation found no legal violations provides no comfort. The response is, of course they found no violations when they only looked at whether materials explicitly promote domestic violence. That's not what we've been trying to tell you. That's not where the harm lies. This gets at a fundamental tension in how modern societies understand harm itself. Our legal systems were built primarily to address physical harm and property violations. As societies have evolved, we've expanded legal protections to cover some forms of psychological harm, particularly in contexts like workplace harassment, domestic abuse, and fraud. But religious contexts remain uniquely challenging because of the constitutional and ethical importance we place on religious freedom. We've collectively decided, rightly, that governments shouldn't dictate religious belief or practice, that people must be free to choose even demanding or unusual religious paths, that state power must not be used to enforce religious orthodoxy or suppress minority faiths. These are precious freedoms, hard-won through centuries of religious conflict and persecution. But what happens when religious freedom becomes cover for psychological control? What happens when organizations use our commitment to religious liberty to shield practices that cause genuine harm? What happens when the language of faith and community masks systems of manipulation and coercion? These questions don't have easy answers, but they demand serious engagement rather than reflexive responses on either extreme. We can't simply say, religious freedom is absolute, and ignore psychological harm. But we also can't empower governments to regulate religious practice based solely on subjective assessments of psychological impact. The path forward requires careful thought, clear definitions, robust evidence, and legal frameworks that can distinguish between legitimate religious practice and genuinely harmful psychological control. This is what Denmark is now grappling with publicly. Minister Dahl's statements suggest Denmark may be moving toward attempting this difficult work of legal reform. But success is far from guaranteed. Creating legally sound definitions of psychological violence in religious contexts that will hold up in court while respecting legitimate religious autonomy may prove extremely difficult, perhaps impossible in ways that satisfy everyone involved. Some argue this entire approach is misguided, that the answer isn't better legal definitions but rather better education, support services for those leaving high-control groups, and public awareness campaigns that help people make informed choices about religious involvement. This perspective suggests that trying to legally regulate psychological elements of religious practice will inevitably either fail in court or create dangerous precedents for government interference in religion. Others argue that without legal frameworks, vulnerable people remain unprotected, that education and support services, while valuable, don't address the systemic nature of harmful practices in high-control religious organizations. This perspective maintains that just as we found ways to legally address psychological harm in other contexts, we can and must do so in religious contexts too, even if it requires careful, sophisticated legal work. Perhaps both perspectives hold important truths. Perhaps we need both better legal tools and better support systems. Perhaps addressing psychological harm in religious contexts requires multiple approaches working together rather than a single solution. But what's clear is that simply closing investigations and moving on is no longer acceptable to many people who've experienced or witnessed this harm. The Danish case illustrates this perfectly. The official investigation closed. The minister's statement ensured the conversation didn't. What we're witnessing in Denmark isn't an ending but a transition. The investigation as such is concluded, but the underlying issues remain unresolved and increasingly unavoidable. Minister Dahl's unusual public statement serves as bridge between formal closure and continued engagement. It's an acknowledgement that legal processes have limits, that current laws may be inadequate, that future action may be necessary. It's also a message to former members, current members questioning their involvement, and families affected by these practices. We see you, we hear your concerns, and the official conclusion shouldn't be interpreted as dismissing your experiences. For Jehovah's Witnesses as an organization, the Danish outcome is both victory and warning. They can claim exoneration, point to the investigation's conclusion, assert that government examination found no violations. But they must also contend with a minister publicly stating he has no sympathy for them, explicitly encouraging people to report psychological violence associated with their practices, and suggesting their official recognition might be reconsidered if laws change. The organization avoided immediate consequences but faces an environment of increased scrutiny and potential future legal reform specifically designed to address practices they currently employ. For the broader international community watching this situation, Denmark offers a case study in complexity. It demonstrates both the limitations of current legal frameworks and the growing willingness of democratic governments to engage with psychological harm in religious contexts, even when easy solutions don't exist. It shows that the conversation about high-control religious groups is evolving from whether there's a problem to how legal systems can appropriately address that problem while respecting fundamental freedoms. The Danish case also highlights how investigative journalism remains crucial in bringing these issues to public attention. Without Ekstrabladet's reporting, the investigation likely never would have begun. Without media pressure, officials might have remained comfortable ignoring concerns that didn't fit easily into existing legal categories. This underscores the importance of protecting press freedom as essential to holding both governments and religious organizations accountable. Looking forward, several scenarios seem possible. Denmark could indeed reform its laws to include clearer definitions of psychological violence in religious contexts, potentially becoming a European leader in this area. Such reforms would likely be closely watched by other countries considering similar moves. Alternatively, Denmark might find that creating workable legal definitions proves too difficult, that attempts at legislation either fail or create problems worse than those they aim to solve. In this scenario, Denmark might shift toward the education and support approach rather than legal regulation. A third possibility is that Denmark waits to see how other countries' approaches develop, particularly watching whether Japan's new coercive control laws prove effective and legally sustainable. This cautious approach might appeal to officials wary of repeating Norway's failure. Or perhaps the situation remains largely as it is now. Ongoing tension between acknowledged concerns and legal inability to address them, continued support for individuals leaving high-control groups, but no major legal reforms or enforcement actions. This unsatisfying middle ground might persist for years. Whatever unfolds in Denmark specifically, the broader global pattern seems clear. Democratic societies are increasingly recognizing that psychological harm in religious contexts is a genuine issue that deserves serious attention. The days when governments simply treated all religious organizations as equally worthy of protection and support, regardless of their practices, are ending. But the path from recognition to effective action remains unclear and contested. What the Danish case teaches us is that good intentions aren't enough, that awareness of problems doesn't automatically translate to solutions, that legal systems built for one era may struggle to address harms that are better understood in another era. It teaches us that the intersection of religious freedom and psychological welfare creates genuinely difficult questions without obvious right answers. And perhaps most importantly, it teaches us that when a government official closes an investigation but simultaneously says he has no sympathy for the organization investigated, we should pay attention to that tension rather than focusing solely on the official conclusion. Because sometimes what's not said in an official report matters more than what is. Sometimes the real story lies in the gap between legal findings and moral assessment. Sometimes an investigation's closure is less important than the minister's statement that follows. Denmark's investigation into Jehovah's Witnesses is over on paper. But in every way that actually matters, it's just beginning. The questions it raises, the tensions it exposes, the gaps it reveals between current legal frameworks and contemporary understanding of psychological harm, all of these will shape ongoing debates not just in Denmark but across Europe and beyond. Minister Morten Dahlin's statement, "I have no sympathy for Jehovah's Witnesses," will likely echo longer and matter more than the official investigation conclusion that preceded it. Because in that simple statement lies an entire world of complexity, a recognition that legal clearance doesn't equal moral endorsement, that current laws may be inadequate to address real harms, and that the work of protecting vulnerable people from psychological manipulation within religious contexts is far from finished. The investigation closed. The case remains open, and everyone involved knows it.